Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our final session of the Seminary of the Third Age for 2023, and as you will hear a little later, the final session forever of the Seminary of the Third Age. But you will hear about it being rebadged from the beginning of next year. Okay? Our acknowledgement of country. We pay our respects to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we gather on tonight. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and we respect and value their past, present and ongoing connection to land and cultural beliefs. Now, the theme for our October sessions has been Deciphering Faith in These Times. And we've already looked at deciphering the Bible and deciphering God. So we've got a handle on that, how to decipher the Bible and God. And tonight, we're taking the next step, which is deciphering science and religion. And our presenter for tonight's session is David McKirdy. And in the 1960s, David studied geology to master's degree level at the University of Adelaide, and then went on to complete a PhD in geology at the Australian National University in 1977. As an organic geochemist, he worked for 17 years in government and industry, and then in 1987 he returned to the University of Adelaide to teach and pursue his research interests. He rose to the position of Associate Professor and Deputy Head of the Department of Geology and Geophysics until retiring in 2006. Now, throughout his career, he has authored or co-authored 439 papers, chapters in books, articles, technical and consultancy reports, and a host of other works in his fields of interest. Now, I first met David in the early 1960s when we were both science students at Adelaide University and secondary teaching students at Adelaide Teachers College. We were both active members of the Student Christian movement, and in 1967, David was a groomsman at my wedding, marriage to Meredith, 56 years ago. Now, I've never told David this, and I guess as you get older, there are times for confession, but I actually failed Geology 1 at the university, while he went on to become professor, or associate professor, and deputy head of department. But just reading the titles of those 439 articles really showed me why I failed geology and why he went on to be associate professor and deputy head. Now, the question tonight is, are science and religion necessarily at odds? And I thought that was a great sentence as I read it a few times. It's the only time I've had a sentence which has got is, are following each other. The question tonight is, are science and religion necessarily at odds? Now, David has a very big foot in both camps. He has been a lifelong churchgoer, and it was during his time in the SCM movement that his geology and organic chemistry studies posed very serious questions for the somewhat conservative theology that underpinned his faith at that time. David is the convener of the Progressive Christianity Network Task Group and is now adjunct professor, associate professor, in the School of Earth Sciences. So he does have a very big foot in both religion and science. His faith journey has very much been a matter of reconciling science and religion, and I'll invite him now to share with us some of his faith journey.
Well, thank you very much for that rather long introduction. My presentation tonight is an expansion of a talk I gave 5 years ago down at the Adelaide West Uniting Church on the topic faith.
Can you put up the microphone closer to your face? Oh, I see. Right, thank you.
Is that close enough? Okay. For me, faith is something I've acquired over more than 70 years of living in Christian communities where I've been affirmed as a person and found answers to the questions, where do I find meaning in life and how do I make sense of this world? Faith is about meaning and purpose. It is about the why question. Science, on the other hand, is where I go for answers to the what question, but I'll return to that later in my remarks. Oops. Looking back over my life, I now realise that my faith has been a journey of exploration by way of several significant communities. The first was at Gartrell Memorial Church at Rose Park, where as a 7-year-old I received a prize, Enid Blyton's The Adventures of Brer Rabbit, for my first year's attendance at Sunday school. Then I moved down to Brighton Methodist Church, where Sunday school, the Order of Knights, Christian Endeavour, MYF, and I hesitate to confess the Billy Graham Crusade, were major formative influences on my early understanding of the Christian faith. Then SCM, that Esmond has already mentioned, at Adelaide Teachers College and Adelaide University. And later at the ANU in Canberra, where I undertook my PhD and was also a member of the National Memorial Methodist Church. And lastly, after marrying and returning to Adelaide, the Uniting Church at Unley and Malvern. 6 communities in which I was welcomed, where I formed some of my closest friendships and eventually came to realise Christ's way of living and relating to others was the only one that really worked. It was not until after I joined SCM in 1964 that the geology and organic chemistry majors of my science degree started to pose serious questions for the somewhat conservative theology then underpinning my faith. Arguably, the most fundamental change in my thinking occurred when confronted during my research and later teaching with the vastness of geological time. As you can see from this summary chart, the Earth formed 4.5 billion years ago, whereas the earliest humans did not appear on the scene until 5 seconds to midnight. Oops. Sorry. Where are we? I've lost the pointer. Never mind.
that red button down, and it
Oh, it's the red
works
button.
very nicely.
Okay. Right. A seminal moment was when, during my PhD research at ANU, I discovered isotopic signatures of early life in sedimentary rocks about 3.5 billion years ago, or deposited 3.5 billion years ago, from South Africa. And that was published in this paper in Geology. Back to my undergraduate years, it was the SCM that introduced me to modern theologians like John Robinson and his book Honest to God, and to Paul Tillich's The Shaking of the Foundations. It was the SCM that sponsored the lunchtime address I remember hearing in the cloisters at Adelaide University on the topic Science and God, given by the famous Australian scientist and theologian Charles Birch. Over the following decades, my bookshelves became home to numerous books by other theologians, most recently those of John Spong, Val Webb, Bart Ehrman, Richard Holloway, Greta Vosper, and the members of the Jesus Seminar, all of them bringing the tools of modern scholarship to the task of uncovering the origin, authorship, and meaning of the Bible for citizens of the 20th and 21st century. Fast forward to 2014. Now long retired after a fulfilling career as a geoscientist in government, industry and academia, and having become increasingly disillusioned with the Church's teachings, out of the blue I received a phone call from my old SCM mate Esmond, inviting me to join the committee of PCNet SA. That community is now my spiritual home, where I feel most at ease and encouraged to continue my faith journey. Over recent years, my faith has evolved to the point where I would now describe myself as a Christian agnostic. The language and concepts I now employ to give expression to my faith bear very little resemblance to those I would have used for much of my life in the church. A major reason for this may be encapsulated in the words of Albert Einstein: religion without science is blind. Science deals with empirical evidence. As my famous American geochemical colleague, the late Professor John Hayes, was fond of saying when he was presented with a new discovery, he would say, "Show me your data." Science addresses the what question I mentioned earlier, helping us to understand the physical world we inhabit and how it works. Extensive knowledge is now available, enabling us to better understand the physical world. But this knowledge was not available to the authors of the Old and the New Testaments, all of whom had their own slant on what was important. In our worship services, we continue to pray, "Our Father who is in heaven," and mindlessly recite the Apostles' Creed, thereby implying the existence of a three-tiered universe, virgin birth, and bodily resurrection. Most of our prayers of intercession are directed towards an interventionist God who can cure illness and disease and even stop wars. We are told in the Bible that a slave community of Hebrews resided in Egypt for 400 years, that Moses and his people wandered in Sinai for 40 years, that Solomon built not just a temple twice the size of any temple so far excavated in Israel, but also a palace of similar dimensions to accommodate 300 wives and 700 concubines. And yet, not one of these major events left behind any archaeological evidence. Isn't it time that our faith caught up with and acknowledged the historical and physical reality of the world as we now know it? So here's a question for each of you to consider. In what sense has your life in the church been a journey of discovery? And what have been the significant steps along the way to where you now find yourself? I invite you to just take 5 to 10 minutes to reflect on what you've just heard and to share your thoughts with your neighbours. Okay. There'll be an opportunity at the end for you to make comments and to ask questions. So let's move on. Having set the scene, as it were, I'd now like to explore in a little more detail the contrasting roles science and religion play in the modern world. Listen first to the words of British immunologist and Nobel Prize winner Sir Peter Medawar. In his book, The Limits of Science, published in 1984, he writes, "Science is a great and glorious enterprise, the most successful that human beings have ever engaged in. To reproach it for its inability to answer all the questions we would like to put to it is no more sensible than to reproach a railway locomotive for not flying or not performing any other operation for which it was not designed. It is not to science, therefore, but to metaphysics, imaginative literature, or religion that we must turn for answers to questions that have to do with the first and last things." And by first and last things, I understand Medawar to be referring to the meaning and purpose of life. He goes on, "Because the answers to these questions neither arise out of nor require validation by empirical evidence, it is not useful or even meaningful to ask whether they are true or false. The issue is whether or not they bring peace of mind in the anxiety of incomprehension. The failure of science to answer such questions does not in any way entail the acceptability of answers of other kinds, nor can it be taken for granted that because these questions can be put, they can be answered. So far as our understanding goes, they cannot. So then, who or what are scientists? In an earlier book, Medawar wrote, "Scientists are people of very dissimilar temperaments, doing different things in very different ways. Among scientists are collectors, classifiers, and compulsive tidiers up. Many are detectives by temperament, and many are explorers. Some are artists, and others are artisans. There are poet scientists and philosopher scientists, and even a few mystics. How then might we tackle the task of deciphering the relationship between science and religion? I shall attempt to do this tonight by dipping into the contents of 5 recent best-selling books. The God Delusion by evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, The Dawkins Delusion, Atheist Fundamentalism and the Denial of the Divine by theologian Alistair McGrath and psychologist Joanna Collicott McGrath. Reason, Faith and Revolution, Reflections on the God Debate by literary theorist and critic Terry Eagleton. The Science Delusion by another biologist, Rupert Sheldrake. And finally, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World by psychiatrist and neuroscientist Ian McGilchrist. Let's begin with the perspective of prominent scientist and militant atheist Richard Dawkins. Here he is in conversation with John Lennox, a professor of mathematics at Oxford University and renowned commentator on the interface between science, philosophy and religion. When you consider the beauty of the world and you wonder how it came to be what it is, you are naturally overwhelmed with a feeling of awe, a feeling of admiration, and you almost feel a desire to worship something. I feel this. I recognise that other scientists, such as Carl Sagan, feel this, and Einstein felt it. We all of us share a kind of religious reverence for the beauties of the universe, for the complexity of life, for the sheer magnitude of the cosmos, the sheer magnitude of geological time, and amen to that. And it's tempting to translate that feeling of awe into a desire to worship some particular thing, a person, an agent. What science has now achieved is an emancipation from that impulse to attribute these things to a creator. In his book, The God Delusion, Dawkins is somewhat more combative. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully.
Sounds like Putin, doesn't it?
As long as we accept the principle that religious faith must be respected simply because it is religious faith, it is hard to withhold respect from the faith of Osama bin Laden and the suicide bombers. This is one reason why I do everything in my power to warn people against faith itself, not just against so-called extremist faith. The teachings of moderate religion, though not extremist in themselves, are an open invitation to extremism. To summarise then, here is Dawkins' take-home message. Religion is about turning untested belief into unshakable truth through the power of institutions and the passage of time. I am against religion because it teaches us to be satisfied with not understanding the world. Alistair McGrath, an Irish scientist, Christian apologist and author of more than 50 books, and his wife Joanna, a neuropsychologist, Anglican priest and lecturer in the psychology of religion, take issue with Dawkins in their book, The Dawkins Delusion, Atheist Fundamentalism and the Denial of the Divine. Dawkins' book seems more designed to reassure atheists whose faith is faltering than to engage fairly or rigorously with religious believers and others seeking truth. Seekers after truth who would not consider themselves religious may find themselves shocked by Dawkins' aggressive rhetoric, his hectoring and bullying tone towards dyed-in-the-wool faith heads, and his determination to find nothing but fault with religion of any kind. They consider Dawkins to be a secular fundamentalist. Fundamentalism arises when a worldview feels it is in danger, lashing out at its enemies when it fears its own future is threatened. Dawkins seems to think that saying something more loudly and confidently, while ignoring counter-evidence, will persuade the open-minded that religious belief is a type of delusion, that he relies so excessively on rhetoric rather than evidence that would otherwise be his stock in trade as a scientist, clearly indicates that something is wrong with his case. Ironically, the ultimate achievement of the God delusion for modern atheism may be to suggest that this emperor has no clothes. They conclude by asking, might atheism be a delusion about God? Another writer to examine the relationship between science and religion is literary theorist and critic Terry Eggleton. In his book Reason, Faith and Revolution, Reflections on the God Debate. Like Medawar before him, he too asks, what is science and who are its practitioners? He writes, science trades on certain articles of faith like any other form of knowledge. Scientists have become the authoritarian guardians of absolute truth. They are peddlers of a noxious ideology known as objectivity, a notion which simply tarts up their ideological prejudices in acceptably disinterested guise. In a particular reference to Dawkins, he writes, science, like any other human affair, is shot through with prejudice and partisanship, not to speak of ungrounded assumptions, unconscious biases, taken for granted truths, and beliefs too close to the eyeball to be objectified. Like religion, science is a culture, not just a set of procedures and hypotheses. Richard Dawkins declares that science is free of the main vice of religion, which is faith. But as Charles Taylor points out, to hold that there are no assumptions in a scientist's work which aren't already based on evidence is surely a reflection of blind faith, one that can't even feel the occasional tremor of doubt. Charles Taylor, by the way, is a Canadian philosopher, famous among other things for his book, Sources of the Self, the Making of the Modern Identity. Another author to take a critical look at modern science is British biochemist and parapsychologist Rupert Sheldrake, in his bestseller, The Science Delusion, an obvious reference to Dawkins. Sheldrake homes in on what he sees to be the problem with modern science. Contemporary science is based on the philosophy of materialism, which claims that all reality is material or physical. The science delusion is the belief that science already understands the nature of reality in principle, leaving only the details to be filled in. The facts of science are real enough, so are the techniques that scientists use and the technologies based on them. But the belief system that governs conventional scientific thinking is an act of faith. Sheldrake's take-home message is, science at its best is an open-minded method of inquiry, not a belief system. I'm still strongly pro-science, but I also say the Lord's Prayer every day. It covers a lot of ground in her relation to the world. And before we move on, it's only fair to note that Eagleton and Sheldrake are not alone in critiquing science, and they are by no means the first to take issue with it. The institutional church, albeit for different reasons, has long had a problem with the art and practice of science. Look at what it did to two early scientists who laid the foundations to our modern understanding of our place in the universe. The first was Polish mathematician and astronomer Nicholas Copernicus, who proposed that the sun is the centre of the solar system and the planets circle the sun, in contradiction of what the Bible had to say on this matter. During the Reformation, both Catholics and Protestants therefore agreed on one thing. They hated Copernicus. He was not only wrong, but also a menace. John Calvin said, "Who will venture to place the authority of Copernicus above that of the Holy Spirit?" While Martin Luther dismissed him as a fool. In 1611, the King James Version of the Bible was published with a note informing its readers that creation occurred on the evening of October the 23rd, 404 BC. 5 years later, the Catholic Church banned all books that suggested that the earth moved at all. The second of these early scientists was Italian natural philosopher, astronomer and mathematician Galileo Galilei. An acolyte of Copernicus, Galileo's use of the optical telescope to observe the night sky revolutionised astronomy and led to fundamental contributions to the science of motion and to the development of the scientific method. In 1633, he was ordered to appear in Rome to be examined by the Congregation of the Holy Office, that is, the Inquisition. There he was declared guilty of heresy and forced to sign a formal renunciation of his magnum opus, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. Here is another pause, this time to reflect on the modern church's response, or lack thereof, to what scientists are telling us about climate change and the future of the earth as a habitable planet. Take another 5 minutes to just contemplate that and talk amongst yourself. Right. Let's move on. Listen to what a group of 12 leading climate scientists have just published in the journal Bioscience. As scientists, we are increasingly being asked to tell the public the truth about the crises we face in simple and direct terms. The truth is that we are shocked by the ferocity of the extreme weather events in 2023. We are afraid of the uncharted territory that we have now entered. Massive suffering due to climate change is already here, and we have now exceeded many safe and just Earth systems boundaries, imperiling stability and life support systems. Rather than focusing on only carbon reduction and climate change, addressing the underlying issue of ecological overshoot will give us our best shot at surviving these challenges in the long run. So Ripple and his co-authors conclude, this is our moment to make a profound difference for all life on Earth, and we must embrace it with unwavering courage and determination to create a legacy of change that will stand the test of time. Perhaps climate scientists can be regarded as modern-day prophets. Moving on, is there any way that we can make sense of what has long been and still is a contentious relationship between science and religion? The answer is yes, and I'd like to thank my old friend Don Vinell for lending me this book by British psychiatrist and philosopher Ian McGilchrist. It introduced me to the concept of the divided brain. I'd like to suggest that McGilchrist's explanation of the divided brain can help us understand why, for many people, there is an apparent conflict between religion and science. The right hemisphere of the brain yields a world of individual, changing, evolving, interconnected, implicit, incarnate, living beings within the context of the lived world, but who in the nature of things are never fully graspable and always imperfectly known. The left hemisphere, on the other hand, is dependent on denotative language and abstraction. It yields clarity and power to manipulate things that are known, fixed, static, isolated, decontextualised, explicit, disembodied, and general in nature, but ultimately lifeless. McGilchrist goes on, the left hemisphere needs certainty and needs to be right. Since the left is concerned with what is certain, with the knowledge of the facts, its version of belief that it is just the absence of certainty. Its version of belief is that it is just absence of certainty. As an aside, Dawkins would appear to be left brain dominant. So, is there a conflict between science and religion? According to McGilchrist, all knowledge, particularly scientific knowledge, is no more than an acting as if certain models were true. Truth and belief are profoundly connected. It is only the left hemisphere that thinks there is certainty to be found anywhere. The right hemisphere makes it possible to hold several ambiguous possibilities in suspension together without premature closure on one outcome. So, given that each human brain has two hemispheres, there's no reason why it can't accommodate both scientific and religious thinking. Listen to what quantum physicist Max Planck, another Nobel Prize winner, had to say. Anybody who has been seriously engaged in scientific work of any kind realises that over the entrance to the gates of the Temple of Science are written the words, "Ye must have faith." It is a quality which the scientists cannot dispense with. Science cannot solve the ultimate mystery of nature, and that is because, in the last analysis, we ourselves are part of nature and therefore part of the mystery that we are trying to solve. I love those words. In his presentation entitled God Talk, Reuniting Science and Religion, that he presented to Pitt Street Uniting Church in 2016, visiting American philosopher and progressive theologian, the Reverend Dr. Robin Myers, made some interesting points. Many people have decided they no longer believe in the sky god of their childhood, or as Americans would say, the man upstairs. It might therefore surprise Richard Dawkins to know that many of his religious folks don't believe in the God he doesn't believe in either. The Bible is a record of ancient conversations that took place in an ancient cosmology vastly different from that of the modern world. We should stop saying the Bible says. The more accurate term is the Bible said. And so the challenge confronting we progressive Christians is to ask, what of it, what if any of it, is relevant to us today? Myers goes on, we need to get over the idea that science and religion are natural enemies, when in fact they are natural partners. There are scientists who talk more like theologians than theologians do. Science is where the insatiably curious keep opening door after door, and all of them lead into a room called wonder. Speaking as a scientist, if I were to distill the essence of what Myers is saying, it would be, awe and wonder are the realm of religion. The currency of science is data, whereas religion deals in myth, metaphor and meaning. It is no accident that one of the core values of progressive Christianity is to embrace the insights of contemporary science. In conclusion then, I'd like to be part of a 21st century church witnessing to a faith that has cast off the shackles of doctrines formulated long ago by sages with a limited understanding of how the world works, and instead embraces new advances in scholarship and science while seeking to emulate the life and love of Christ in the here and now. And I leave you with one final exercise in deciphering. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David, for leading us through your exploration of the relationship between science and religion. Are there any questions that people have?
We'll bring around the microphone if there are.
Right. Just let Fergus know if you want to ask a question.
I'm really not many words can say I'm actually enthralled and fascinated with your presentation. I'll start with the simple theory I came up in my own head a long time ago, that God created everything, even science. And if that being the case, God just put everything together and said, all right, let us start. And well, we've been working out how ever since.
A comment that is, rather than a question, isn't it? Yep. Did you want David to respond to that? Yep.
I think that's a fair comment.
Just if you
Yep.
respond to the microphone.
Yeah, I guess my problem is who or what is God? But that's...
The singularity in the black hole.
Sorry, say that again.
The singularity in the black hole is something that is undiscovered, but we already know about it.
Yeah, thanks, David. I'm going to have to talk with you two because I was in SCM in Adelaide Teachers College from 65 to 68.
Oh,
and
we
none
were
of
there.
us remember each other. So we'll see what names I can dig out. No, I've been taken by my disagreement with Richard Dawkins for a long time, not because of what he says, but because I think he's a bad scientist, but he might be just a representative of bad science. From what I've heard him say himself, he ignores evidence that he doesn't like. He would not classify any of us as Christians because we are not the kind of Christian he wants to not like.
Yeah.
So the McGrath people that you mentioned in your first response to him, I agree quite strongly with them. I think it's probably enough for now, otherwise I'll never stop.
Calls me an old chap. Well, I have had some thoughts about these things for a number of years, and
I know.
thank you very much, David. I look forward to seeing you at my place and we can discuss further. So delightful what you have presented. So I have to pick one thing to ask, so I'm picking one thing. That is, Sheldrake talks about some scientists or some scientific processes as acts of faith, you said, something like that. I think faith for me is not quite the word, and we could leave it as a question for you for later, but I take the point you made, and I'm saying it again, that science is mostly empirical, based on sense data, and then rationalisation or rational thinking within that data set or sets. But that for me is a difficulty because for me empiricalism is not so much an act of faith but as a metaphysical position, assuming that there's no other way of apprehending God or the universal life or truth, and more importantly that there aren't other elements and dimensions beyond the empirical. So that's sort of where I'm at. You might respond or not, but it's a comment or a question, whatever you want to take. If you understand, I think you do what I'm saying. Empiricism is itself a metaphysical position because it excludes other possibilities. Or can.
I think I'd be preferred, pardon me, I'd prefer that to our coming discussion up at your place. I'd leave it till then.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Listening to a mathematician and some philosophers, and the philosophers wanted to hear that there was some absolute truth in mathematics. But the mathematician said that the mathematicians, I'm not sure the exact date, but back in 1890 or whenever, simply had to come together and agree to the axiom of the use of numbers. And so effectively, even though it's perhaps not a step of faith, but it's, and the philosophers, this is at Adelaide Uni just 10, 20 years ago, the philosophers were wanting him to be able to prove that numbers existed. But the mathematicians simply said, no, we just had to agree on this as an axiom that we start with, but we can't prove it. So it was an interesting discussion between scientists and philosophers as well. And these were mostly atheist philosophers, which is what Adelaide Uni is well known for. So I found it, as a theologian, quite an interesting discussion.
It just depends on where you want to plant your foot. A physicist I know said, never mind, and the psychiatrist said it doesn't matter. You'll be pleased to know that I have a transcript of David's presentation. So if you'd like to look through it some more and ponder it, then these are available. I'll put them on the front seat. Not only is there a transcript, but there's a set of some of the slides if you didn't catch what was written on the slide or the references and so on. So feel free to take one of each of those if you would like to. And let me just... oh, you've got a question?
I have got a question.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. And I didn't realise how old David was. I'm one of his colleagues. But he's been a little bit deceptive in his discussion of science, because he's old enough to actually have had to have seen the light with regard to some geological principles. And I'm just wondering if you're going to talk about that. Where did you sit with global warming? With plate tectonics from your early days. How did you cope with that great change?
I didn't have a problem with that, although the professor down in the University of Hobart obviously did. What I will say is that my entire career has been involved in working within and alongside the petroleum industry, fossil fuel industries. At one stage I was employed as a coal geologist in the mines department here. And it wasn't until many years ago that penny started to drop when I started looking at the historical record of the atmosphere recorded in ice cores, and how the level of CO2 in those bubbles encased in ice has been steadily climbing since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And not only that, the isotopic composition of that CO2 has been changing and getting more and more negative, because the CO2 has come from the combustion of fossil fuels. And so, although I'm now have an adjunct position in the geology or the School of Earth Sciences, I no longer go to any meetings of the Petroleum Exploration Society of Australia, even though many of my publications have been published in their journal. And so for me, it's been a real problem trying to reconcile where my professional life has been spent and what I now see as the state of the planet and what's caused it.
Before you get on, I've got a serious question. You are old enough to remember that there was a time when people were being thrown out of lecture halls because they believed in continental drift and things like that. Do you remember that?
No.
That period? You
No,
never encountered that?
I had no personal encounter with that.
Yeah, it was as bad as wars of religion. That's what we had Tuzo Wilson come out, and by that time peace had been made, but people were exiled and what does the church do when they don't like someone? Excommunicated.
Yeah.
That was happening in the societies, and it sounded quite a bad time. But so Adelaide was always very open. Adelaide University didn't have as you say, it wasn't like the University of Tasmania.
Yeah, and I will say that Adelaide University's School of Earth Sciences is now world famous for its work, its research that it's doing on continental drift and the construction of the planets, the history of the opening up of oceans and all of that. They're world leaders in that.
Okay, well, we shall leave it there, and thank you, David, for extensive answering of questions, and we can see that you have been converted several times. Let me just briefly say that within the Progressive Christianity Network task group, we've been looking at the Seminary of the Third Age as perhaps giving the impression that we are really only for retired people, being the Third Age, and we're a seminary, a kind of teaching organisation, which we're not necessarily. So we have decided that from the beginning of 2024, we are going to rebrand this activity as the Progressive Christianity Forum, which we think has a broader sort of title and, we hope, greater appeal. So we shall, in February of next year, be launching the Progressive Christianity Forum, which will do much the same kinds of things, or even better things. We'll have dancing girls and champagne at the launch, and you will hear about our program for 2024. So keep your eyes on the communications that we have, and you'll see when the launch is going to be and what the program will be for 2024. And I'll put these out and take one of each.
Thank you very much.
Has anyone deciphered the question?
No.
Turn it upside down, I might have a better.
No.
I'm dyslexic.
It's an anagram of all altar boy, laboratory.
Oh.